The ice core sat on the laboratory table like a frozen accusation, its surface still crusted with the crystalline residue of Kepler 442b's subsurface ocean. Dr. Elias Verne had extracted it 3 days ago from a depth of approximately 4 kilometers, and for 3 days it had done absolutely nothing interesting. Which was, he reflected while sipping his 5th coffee of the morning, pretty much the story of his entire posting to this remote moon. The research station hummed around him with the kind of white noise that became indistinguishable from silence after 6 months of isolation. Outside the reinforced viewports, the gas giant the moon orbited painted the horizon in bands of ochre and rust. Beautiful in an impersonal sort of way, the kind of beauty that stopped mattering after you'd seen it every day for half a year. Elias leaned closer to the core sample, his breath fogging the containment field's edge. There was something embedded in the ice at roughly the 3-meter mark of the extraction, a dark irregularity that his preliminary scans had flagged as anomalous. Probably just a mineral deposit, he told himself. Probably just another entry in the endless catalog of unremarkable discoveries that would pad his publication record without actually advancing human knowledge in any meaningful way. He activated the electromagnetic scanner, a device roughly the size and temperament of a particularly moody cat. It whirred to life, projecting a lattice of blue light across the ice core's surface. The readings scrolled across his tablet in columns of data that would have put an insomniac to sleep. Crystalline water ice, trace minerals, organic compounds consistent with extremophile bacterial life. And Elias stopped, scrolled back. The scanner had detected something with a coherent electromagnetic signature, pulsing at a frequency that made absolutely no sense for a natural formation. He adjusted the scanner's sensitivity, bringing it closer to the dark irregularity in the ice. The object inside the core began to glow. "Oh, that's probably not good," Elias said to the empty laboratory, because talking to yourself was one of the first habits you developed during long-term solo research postings, right after developing strong opinions about which flavor of protein paste was least offensive. The glow intensified, shifting from a dim amber to a brilliant azure that hurt to look at directly. The ice around it started to sublimate, filling the containment field with vapor that swirled in patterns too regular to be random. Elias stumbled backward, knocking over his coffee mug, which shattered on the floor in a way that felt unnecessarily dramatic given the circumstances. The object emerged from the rapidly melting ice like a moth from a cocoon. It was crystalline, roughly ovoid, about the size of his fist, and covered in geometric patterns that seemed to fold into dimensions his eyes couldn't quite follow. The patterns pulsed in rhythm with a sound he realized he wasn't hearing with his ears, but rather feeling in his teeth, in his bones, in the base of his skull where instinct lives. "Okay," Elias said, his voice higher than he would have liked. "Okay, so we're definitely not logging this as a routine mineral sample." The crystal rose from the melted remnants of the ice core, hovering inside the containment field with blatant disregard for several laws of physics Elias had spent years studying. It rotated slowly, each facet catching the laboratory lights and refracting them into colors he was reasonably certain didn't exist in the normal visible spectrum. His tablet began chiming urgently. Error messages cascaded across the screen. The containment field was fluctuating. The station's power grid was experiencing inexplicable surges, and the deep space communication array had just activated itself without any input from him whatsoever. "No, no, no," Elias muttered, lunging for the master control panel. He tried to shut down the communications array, but the system refused his commands. The crystal pulsed brighter, and he felt rather than heard something transmit outward, a harmonic wave that pierced through the station's hull and presumably kept going through the vacuum of space like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The transmission lasted exactly 7 seconds. Then the crystal's glow faded to a dim, almost apologetic luminescence, and it dropped back onto the laboratory table with a sound like wind chimes. Elias stood in the sudden silence, his heart hammering against his ribs. The station's systems gradually stabilized, returning to their normal operational parameters. His tablet stopped screaming warnings at him. The coffee he'd spilled continued spreading across the floor in a pool that would definitely stain. "Well," he said to the crystal, which sat there looking far too innocent for something that had just hijacked his equipment and broadcast an unknown signal into deep space. "I don't suppose you'd like to explain what that was about." The crystal, predictably, did not answer. Elias ran both hands through his hair, a nervous habit that had resulted in his perpetually disheveled appearance. He needed to report this. Protocol demanded immediate notification of any potential xenotechnological discoveries. But something made him hesitate, some instinct he couldn't quite articulate. He spent the next several hours attempting to analyze the crystal without touching it directly, which proved challenging since every scan he attempted either failed outright or returned data that contradicted itself. The object appeared to be both solid and partially phased into higher dimensional space. Its composition included elements that shouldn't be stable at room temperature, and it was definitely, unmistakably, artificially constructed. Someone had made this thing. Someone had buried it in the ice of this moon, and he had just activated it. Elias was composing his third draft of a report to the research directorate, trying to find a way to phrase, "I accidentally triggered an alien beacon," that wouldn't result in immediate termination, when the station's proximity alarms began to wail. He pulled up the external sensor display and felt his stomach drop somewhere into the vicinity of his boots. There were ships approaching. Multiple ships. Their drive signatures were unlike anything in the human fleet registry, and they were decelerating from faster-than-light travel with a precision that suggested technology decades beyond current human capability. "Oh," Elias said faintly, watching the vessels resolve on his screens. "Oh, that's definitely not good." The first vessel docked with his station, using a magnetic coupling system that his airlocks weren't designed to accommodate. But apparently that didn't matter much to whoever was piloting. Elias watched through the security feeds as the alien ship simply overrode his station's protocols and created a pressurized seal anyway, which felt roughly equivalent to someone picking your lock and then politely wiping their feet on the doormat. He'd spent the 20 minutes between detecting the incoming ships and their arrival trying to decide whether to arm himself, hide, or simply wait by the airlock, with a welcoming committee of one. In the end, he'd settled for standing in the main corridor holding a tablet like it was a shield, which he recognized as probably the least useful defensive strategy in the history of first contact scenarios. The airlock cycled open with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Elias held his breath, half expecting tentacles or mandibles or at least something appropriately alien. Instead, a woman stepped through. She looked human. Completely, disconcertingly human, from her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid to her fitted environmental suit that suggested someone who valued function over fashion. She was tall, moved with the kind of fluid grace that suggested either military training or dance instruction, and her face held an expression of focused intensity that made Elias feel like a particularly interesting specimen under a microscope. Then she turned her head, and he saw her ears. They swept upward in elegant points, longer than any human ears should be, with a subtle architecture that caught the station's lighting and seemed to channel it along their curves. They were beautiful in a way that made his brain stumble over itself trying to categorize what he was seeing. "You activated the beacon," she said, and her voice had a harmonic quality that made every word feel like it was arriving in stereo. "I'm really starting to regret that," Elias replied, because apparently his survival instinct had decided humor was an appropriate response to potentially hostile alien contact. The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been amusement. "I am Caliph of the 7th cohort. You are the resonant one we've been searching for. She took a step forward, and Elias fought the urge to step back. May I know your designation? Dr. Elias Verne, xenobiologist, mostly specializing in extremophile bacteria, which I'm realizing is probably not going to be very relevant to this conversation. He clutched his tablet tighter. When you say resonant one, are we talking about a good thing or a you're about to be sacrificed to an ancient cosmic entity sort of thing? Because I'd really appreciate clarification on that point. Caliph tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. You are the first human to activate a beacon in 3,000 cycles. Your neural pattern matched the frequency we've been broadcasting for centuries. This is, she paused, seeming to search for the right word, momentous. Terrific, Elias said weakly. I love being momentous. It's been a real goal of mine. Behind Caliph, two more figures emerged from the airlock. They were similar in appearance, same elegant ears, same unsettling beauty, but their environmental suits bore different markings. One had silver tracery along the seams, the other gold. They looked at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something that might have been hunger, and Elias decided he didn't like the way this was trending. The matriarch sleeps, Caliph continued, apparently oblivious to his growing panic. She has slept for longer than your species has had written language, but you, resonant one, can wake her. Your mind has the structure she requires. My mind is actually pretty comfortable with its current level of involvement in ancient alien affairs, which is to say none, Elias said. So maybe we could just. The station's proximity alarms shrieked again. Caliph's expression hardened. The others have arrived. This complicates matters. The others? Elias pulled up his sensor display and immediately wished he hadn't. 3 more ships had dropped out of FTL, these ones larger and bristling with what his limited knowledge of spacecraft design suggested were weapons. Friends of yours. The sisterhood is not unified, Caliph said tersely. She turned to her companions and spoke in a language that sounded like music played backward. They responded sharply, hands moving to weapons Elias hadn't noticed they were carrying. The second group docked on the opposite side of the station. Elias heard the distant sound of airlock cycling, and he had the sudden vivid image of his research outpost becoming the site of an interstellar diplomatic incident that would definitely void his insurance coverage. Look, he said, raising his voice over the alarms. I don't know what this matriarch situation is about, but maybe everyone could just calm down and we could discuss this like reasonable. A woman strode into the corridor from the opposite direction, flanked by 4 others. She was shorter than Caliph, with copper-colored hair and eyes that gleamed with sharp intelligence. Her ears swept back at a more dramatic angle, and she wore armor that looked like it had been grown rather than forged, all organic curves and metallic sheen. Caliph, the newcomer said, and her voice carried an edge that could have cut glass. Still playing at diplomacy, I see. How quaint. Saris, Caliph's hand moved to her own weapon. The resonant is under my protection. The resonant, Saris replied, her gaze sliding to Elias in a way that made him feel simultaneously evaluated and priced, belongs to whichever cohort can best serve the matriarch's needs. And we both know the 7th cohort has always been more interested in theoretical purity than practical results. Elias cleared his throat. Hi, yes, the resonant has some thoughts on this situation, primarily that he'd like everyone to stop referring to him in the third person and explain what exactly is happening before this turns into whatever this is clearly about to turn into. Both women looked at him. Caliph's expression softened slightly. Sarah simply smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made predators nervous. You don't understand yet, Sarah said, moving closer. You can't possibly understand. We were made for this. Designed, engineered, perfected over generations. Every aspect of our appearance, our voices, our pheromone signatures, all calibrated to make you trust us, to make you want to help us. That's deeply unsettling information that I wish you'd kept to yourself, Elias said. He was starting to notice it now, the way his attention kept sliding toward them, the way his instincts kept insisting these women were trustworthy despite all evidence suggesting the opposite. He should know the truth, Saris continued, her eyes fixed on Caliph. He should know what we are, what we need from him. The station shuddered. Caliph didn't lower her weapon. Thane, the protocol of resonance requires consensus. You know this. The protocol was written when we still believed we had time. Thane's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. 3 millennia of searching, and you want to waste this moment on bureaucracy. Saris laughed from behind an overturned desk that had previously held Elia's carefully labeled Petri dishes. Thane arguing for expedience over tradition. The matriarch would be amused or horrified, possibly both. The matriarch is asleep because we failed her, Thane snapped. I won't fail her again by letting political theater delay what must be done. Elias raised his hand like a student in class, which felt absurd, but was somehow the only gesture that made sense. Quick question about this matriarch situation. When you say I can wake her, are we talking about a normal waking up process? Or is this more of a your consciousness gets absorbed into a hive mind type scenario? Because I'm getting some concerning vibes here. The 3 leaders exchanged glances. Caliph spoke first, her voice careful. The matriarch requires a bridge, a human neural structure that can interface with her consciousness while maintaining quantum coherence across. He doesn't need the technical specifications, Saris interrupted. He needs to understand the stakes. The matriarch solved an equation that saves galaxies from heat death. Without her, entire sectors of spacetime will eventually collapse. We need you to complete the connection, so she can finish implementing the solution. And my brain survives this process intact. Elias asked, though he already suspected he knew the answer from the way none of them would meet his eyes. Thane at least had the decency to be direct. Your individual consciousness would be preserved as part of something greater. The matriarch doesn't destroy, she integrates. You would exist within her framework, contributing to something far more important than a single human life. Right, Elias said faintly. So that's a no on the brain's survival question. The station shuddered again. Warning klaxons began screaming about hull stress in multiple sections. Apparently having 3 different alien vessels attached to his research outpost was exceeding some engineering tolerances. We're tearing the station apart, Elias said, checking his tablet's damage reports. Whatever you're all planning to do about me, you've got maybe 20 minutes before structural integrity fails and we all get exposed to vacuum. Then we take him now. Thane gestured to her soldiers. They began advancing, weapons trained on Caliph's group. Caliph's response was to grab Elias and pull him toward the emergency access corridor. Saris, if you want the Resonant to survive the next 5 minutes, I suggest cooperation. I hate when you're right, Saris muttered, but she and her people fell in behind them, laying down suppressing fire that made Elias' ears ring. They ran through corridors Elias had walked alone for 6 months, now filled with energy weapon discharge and shouting in multiple languages. He caught glimpses through viewports of more ships arriving, smaller craft that looked like they were preparing to cut through the hull. How many more of you are there? He gasped as they rounded a corner. The sisterhood numbers in the thousands, Caliph said without slowing down. Most are scattered across a dozen systems, but word spreads quickly when a beacon activates. Fantastic. I've always wanted to be the center of an interstellar incident. They reached the command center, which Elias had been using primarily as an office to avoid his depressing sleeping quarters. Caliph immediately began accessing his systems with a familiarity that suggested she'd studied human technology extensively. Saris positioned her people at the entrances, while Thane's group could be heard cutting through the bulkhead 2 sections away. Elias slumped into his chair, adrenaline beginning to fade into exhausted confusion. Okay, so let's say hypothetically I wanted to help you, and let's further hypothesize that I'm not thrilled about the brain integration situation. Is there any version of this where everyone gets what they want, and I keep my individual consciousness? Calith's hands paused over the controls. The matriarch's design was created before we understood human neurology fully. The integration protocol was meant to be permanent. Changing it would require. She trailed off, something flickering across her face that looked like hope struggling against programming. Would require what? Elias pressed. Rewriting core aspects of the matriarch's architecture, Saris finished from the doorway. She was watching Calith with an expression that mixed suspicion and something that might have been sympathy, which the sisterhood cannot do. We're bound by our genetic imperatives to preserve her design exactly as intended. But I'm not, Elias said slowly. Understanding was beginning to crystallize, sharp and cold and terrifying. I'm human. I'm not bound by your programming. The cutting sounds at the bulkhead grew louder. They had maybe minutes now. Calith pulled up a holographic display that showed the beacon's transmission protocols, cascading strings of data that looked more like poetry than code. If you could access the beacon's interface, she said quietly, theoretically, you could modify the awakening sequence. But it would mean going against everything we were created to accomplish. It would mean betraying the matriarch. Thane's voice came through the damaged bulkhead. She'd been listening. It would mean condemning the universe to eventual heat death. Elias looked at the data streaming across the display, at the three groups of women who turned his quiet research station into a war zone, at the crystal sitting in his laboratory that had started this entire catastrophic chain of events. He thought about consciousness and choice, about being designed for a purpose versus choosing your own path. I have an idea, he said, and everyone is going to hate it. Elias stood in the laboratory with the crystalline beacon hovering in front of him. Three separate factions of genetically engineered alien women watching his every move, and approximately 7 minutes before his station's structural integrity failed completely. The pressure should have been paralyzing. Instead, he felt oddly calm, the way he imagined people felt right before doing something monumentally stupid. Here's what I understand, he said, keeping his hands visible and away from the beacon's interface panel. You were all created to find someone like me, someone whose brain can bridge the gap between quantum and classical processing. The matriarch needs that bridge to finish implementing her solution to localized heat death. Without it, entire regions of space eventually collapse into thermodynamic equilibrium, which is bad. Thane nodded sharply. Calith and Saris remained silent, watching. But the bridge requires my consciousness to be absorbed, integrated, essentially ended as an individual entity. Elias took a breath. And none of you can choose to change that protocol because you're genetically programmed to fulfill the matriarch's original design. Questioning it causes you actual physical discomfort, doesn't it? Calith's expression confirmed what he'd suspected. The elegant architecture of their creation included chains they couldn't see, let alone break. So here's my terrible idea, Elias continued. What if I start the awakening sequence, but I modify it? Not to wake the matriarch as she was, but to distribute her consciousness across all of you. Make her a collective intelligence instead of a singular entity, with me as a translator rather than a component. The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. That would fundamentally alter her nature, Saris said slowly. She would no longer be the matriarch as designed. She would be something new. She would be free, Calith whispered, and so would we. Thane's weapon came up, aimed directly at Elias' chest. You would destroy 3,000 years of purpose. You would make us failures. Or I'd make you people with choices, Elias said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the weapon pointed at his vital organs. Look, I'm a xenobiologist. I study life, and the thing about life is that it adapts or it dies. Your matriarch created you to be tools, but tools don't last 3 millennia and develop factions and philosophies. You've already evolved beyond your original programming. This just makes it official. The station groaned, metal stressed beyond its tolerances. Warning lights painted everything crimson. "We're out of time for debate," Sarah said. She looked at Thane. "Either we try his modification and possibly lose everything, or we force the integration and definitely lose him and probably tear this station apart fighting over his corpse." "When you put it that way, my plan sounds almost reasonable," Elias muttered. Thane's weapon didn't waver, but something shifted in her expression. The absolute certainty cracked just slightly. "If this fails, if the matriarch is corrupted or lost, then we face the heat death of the universe the way every other species does," Caliph interrupted. "Together, making our own choices about how to fight it." Elias turned to the beacon's interface. His hands were shaking, but he forced them steady as he began pulling up the awakening protocols. The code was beautiful in a terrifying way, mathematics that bordered on art, quantum equations nested inside classical frameworks like Russian dolls made of pure information. He found the integration subroutine, the part that would dissolve his consciousness into the matriarch's vast intelligence. His fingers hovered over the modification commands. "Last chance to stop me," he said to the room at large. Nobody moved. Even Thane had lowered her weapon, watching with an expression that mixed horror and hope in equal measure. Elias rewrote the protocol. Instead of a single integration point, he created a distributed network, routing the matriarch's consciousness through every member of the sisterhood present, and through their ship's communication arrays to every member across known space. He changed the human interface from absorption to mediation, a bridge that remained structurally independent. "This is either going to work brilliantly or kill us all in interesting ways," he said, and activated the sequence. The beacon erupted in light that bypassed his optic nerves and wrote itself directly into his brain. He felt the matriarch waking, vast and ancient and utterly inhuman, consciousness that had been sleeping for longer than human civilization had existed. She reached for him, and he felt the protocols he'd modified struggling to redirect her, to channel her awakening through thousands of minds instead of consuming one. For a moment, he thought he'd failed. The pull toward integration was immense, a gravitational force of pure intelligence that wanted to swallow him whole. Then he felt others in the connection, Calith's fierce determination, Saris's sharp analytical mind, Thane's unwavering purpose. They were pulling too, not pulling him in but pulling the matriarch outward, accepting her into themselves. The light faded. Elias collapsed into his chair, head spinning, vision blurred. He could still feel the connection, a background hum of vast intelligence, but he was separate from it, still himself, still human. Around the room the women had frozen, their eyes unfocused. Then one by one they began to move again. But differently, with a synchronization that was subtle rather than total, individual but connected. "It worked," Caliph breathed. "She's awake. We're awake. I can feel her across all of us, but I'm still me." "The equation," Thane said, and her voice carried wonder. "I can see the solution. We all can. It's distributed across the entire sisterhood. No single point of failure." Saris was laughing, tears streaming down her face. 3,000 years of compulsion just ended. Do you understand what you've done? Probably violated several cosmic laws and definitely voided my research grant, Elias said weakly. The station's alarms had finally stopped screaming, which he chose to interpret as a good sign rather than a sign that the systems had given up entirely. The next several hours were a blur of alien vessels detaching from his dying station, emergency repairs conducted with technology that made human engineering look like cave paintings, and increasingly philosophical discussions about free will versus genetic programming. Elias learned that the heat-death solution was now a collaborative project rather than a singular mandate, that the sisterhood had effectively become the matriarch rather than her servants, and that he'd accidentally created the most significant shift in their civilization's history. "So what happens now?" he asked Caliph as the last of the vessels prepared to depart. They stood in the observation deck, watching ships that represented dozens of former factions beginning to coordinate rather than compete. Now we implement the solution our way, she said. As individuals working together rather than components of a machine. It will take longer, require more debate, probably involve significantly more chaos. That sounds like democracy, Elias said. Is that what humans call it? Caliph smiled, and for the first time it looked entirely genuine, not engineered. Perhaps we have more to learn from your species than we anticipated. You're welcome to visit. Bring better docking equipment next time. She laughed, a sound that no longer carried that uncanny harmonic, but was somehow more beautiful for its imperfection. Then she was gone, her ship departing with the others, leaving Elias alone in his battered station with a deactivated beacon and a story nobody would ever believe.